Ambassador Douglas Lute is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General, and he served as the United States Permanent Representative to NATO from 2013 to 2017. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
It's good to be with you.
Look, I want to talk to you about a lot of different things, but I am completely distracted, and it sends a shiver up my spine to some degree to watch the theater which is taking place in Moscow right now between President Xi of China and President Putin of Russia. This is much more, it seems to me, and I want to ask you, than just some trade meeting. It seems momentous. It seems like we're watching a huge shift in part of the world that wants to undermine the West and try to shift the polar powers that be, if I can say it that way. And how would you characterize it?
Well, I agree. The visit itself seems to be a threshold event, in the sense that in the last year, the first year of the war in Ukraine, President Xi has focused mostly domestically, right? In the run up to the Party Congress in the fall, and his being recommissioned for yet another term as the leader of the CCP and so forth. So, and during that year, the first year of the invasion, China under Xi provided sort of rhetorical and political support for Moscow, but little more. And I think part of that is because of this sort of internal focus that Xi had over the last year. But now, with that next term of leadership secure, he has looked outward. And it's interesting that one of the very first trips, perhaps the first trip that he made after COVID and after being reelected, was to Moscow. And now you see the theater, the choreography, the dramatics of his visit to Moscow. And what's interesting about this is that he seems to be edging beyond rhetorical and political support towards perhaps material support to Russia. And that I think is a serious threshold that we have to watch very carefully. This support might come in the form of military support. There are early reports of sort of small arms and so forth finding their way from China to Russia in support of the war.
But more than that, the New York Times, sir, is reporting today that they sold $12 million in drones. I mean, this is airborne artillery.
Right, or at least airborne observation, right? So yes, this is serious, and I think we'll see in the coming weeks, days, perhaps in weeks, the sort of refinement of these reports and see exactly what has been provided, and whether this was done commercially through second and third channels and so forth to sort of mask the Chinese role, or whether it was actually sponsored by the Chinese government. Of course, the differentiation, the distinction between Chinese government and Chinese industry is pretty murky, right? It's pretty tight. Those are pretty tight connections. But we'll see. It is true, however, I think, and the big point is the one you made by way of the question, that Xi and Putin have common cause here. And the common interest, the common cause is that they both want to contest what they view as the U.S. dominance in the international architecture, the international system over the last 20 or 30 years. And they think that together they can effectively contest that U.S. position.
Then isn't it a mistake for President Biden to, and I don't want to make this political within the U.S., but isn't this a mistake, whether it's Biden or anybody else, that says this is a struggle, Ukraine is a struggle between the autocracies and democracies, and between the East and the West? Doesn't that then push China into a corner where it says we cannot allow Russia to fail?
So I believe that casting it as democracies versus autocracies is too narrow and too restrictive. And I prefer a broader cast, right? Which would be it's a contest between those who believe in international rules of the road as embedded in the or enshrined in the UN Charter and subsequent international agreements in Europe, the Vienna document, and so forth. So those who abide by these and believe in these
so can I
rules,
just translate that, because I'm trying to, I just, before you move forward with it, I just want to understand the rules of the road. You mean kind of post World War II? Countries are countries, and the
right.
the big bully on the block cannot go and take new territory and push over a border.
Exactly, with the two principal rules of the road as enshrined in the UN Charter being territorial integrity. So a nation state's territory is its territory, not to be taken by another, and national sovereignty, meaning that a nation decides on its own what courses it will take, which alliances it will join, which economic and trade relationships it will have, and so forth. So those are the basics. Now, under those basics, there are 1,000 varieties of national government. And I don't think we as Americans need to try to specify a form of democracy or even a form of government, as long as we can agree that there are certain rules of the road. And I think it's actually that those basic, those fundamental rules that are being contested here. I mean, most obviously by the example of Russia invading a neighbor and seizing sovereign Ukrainian territory. And by the way, this didn't start a year ago in February of 2022. It began 8 years before that in 2014, when Russia seized and then illegally annexed Crimea, a sovereign part of Ukraine. So the UN Charter was violated first in 2014, and then just again and repeated in a more violent, virulent way a year ago.
So do you believe that China and Russia buy into the philosophy of spheres of influence, and that they reject the US and the West platform of, you know, a certain list of human rights and of trying to influence other countries internally, where China would say what goes on in China is our business. Russia would say what goes on in Russia, and then now by extension in Ukraine in its sphere of influence, shouldn't concern the West or shouldn't concern specifically America.
I think the distinction, Dana, is that the rules of the road, as I read the UN Charter, says what goes on inside a country is that country's business, is that country's prerogative. What goes on beyond that country's borders, however, is governed by these international rules. And where Russia has crossed the line is when it crossed the line on the boundary of Ukrainian territory. So we should not, in my view, especially for Americans, given the last 20 years of experience, have the ambition that we're going to change internal politics of Russia, for example. But rather, we should expect Russia and the other 190 some members of the UN Charter, of the UN community, to abide by basic rules, like you don't violate another's territory. And look, it's not just spheres of influence. It goes beyond, I think, spheres of influence. In this case, it's military invasion. And in fact, if you listen to Putin carefully, it's an imperial model of international relations, where one country can not only influence the affairs of a neighbor, it can actually dominate and occupy with military force the territory of that neighbor. That's imperialism.
What do you think happened to President Putin? I mean, I'm trying to understand it. I was there when Putin came to power from President Yeltsin in 2000. I've covered him for more than 20 years. I mean, there was a moment where he seemed to embrace. He was, a member of the G8. He was even in the NATO Partnership for Peace program, if that was if I remember correctly, the title of it. I mean, he was Western leaning at one point. What happened to the guy? Did Russia just not succeed and didn't diversify and didn't build like China did in its industrial might? And now he sees military means is kind of the only thing he's got left, and that's the only way that Russia can go forward? I mean, what's your theory?
Well, look, my my memory on this is similar to yours. You know, I remember the NATO-led military intervention in Bosnia, and in the U.S. sector in Bosnia was a Russian brigade, a Russian airborne
There
brigade.
was a bit of competition on the ground there when the Russians rolled into the airport, I think.
Well, that was Kosovo,
That was
right?
Kosovo. Sorry, you said
A couple
Bosnia.
years later.
Right.
But look, when I commanded U.S. forces in Kosovo in 2002, I had a Russian battalion in my sector. And they, you know, they came over for sports day and so forth. So we had not only sort of coexistence, but on the ground during military operations, we actually had cooperation. Now, it wasn't the smoothest cooperation because we were, of course, both coming out of the experience of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
But I also remember later when I was the U.S. ambassador in at NATO that I had a Russian counterpart. I mean, Russia had a diplomatic mission assigned as a partner state, not as a member state, but as a partner state,
And
NATO headquarters.
in fact, they carried out joint operations for anti-terror training, for instance, off oil platforms.
Exactly right. So, and remember, it was Vladimir Putin who made the first phone call to George W. Bush after 9/11, expressing common cause support. Right. So you're right. This version of Putin and this version of Russia seems to have drifted a long way from the 90s and the early 2000s. And what happened to him? Who knows? I think, however, it does fit a pattern. And the pattern is that the more centralized control in a nation state, the more autocratic a leader, the more isolated that leader. And with that isolation comes a trend where loyalty of your staff and subordinates and advisors, loyalty overwhelms competence. And the dissenting voices tend to be muffled or simply silent because it's no
Or
longer
dead or in jail. Yeah.
or you know disappearing and so forth. So the more centralized, the more isolated, the more autocratic, the more I think prone to decisions like Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. And here, of course, there are at least three assumptions that have proven in the last year to be dramatically wrong. Right? I mean, he misread the capability of his own forces.
Mm-hmm.
He misread the virulence of the Ukrainian national cause and the desire by Ukraine to defend itself. And he misread the West in terms of cohesion and unity. Now, how do you go 0 for 3 on those key wartime topics? And my assumption is my conclusion is he was isolated from the hard cold facts in a way that is dangerous. But that isolation of autocratic leaders is very typical.
What is the world going to look like if China slowly gets pulled into this conflict? Not boots on the ground pulled in, but begins to provide more and more aid, dual use aid that can be indeed lethal aid, things like drones. What's the world start to look like as if this progresses with China getting deeper and deeper and supporting Russia militarily?
Well, so if your premise is right, if China moves more obviously into material support for, especially material military support for Putin, China will open itself to the sorts of economic consequences that Putin is suffering right now. And I think what's interesting about that is that China, of course, is much more intertwined with the global economy than Russia was before the invasion. And while Europe, one of the big surprises for me here is how quickly and nearly completely in 1 year's time, Europe has weaned itself off of Russian energy. But of course, the Russian supply of energy to Europe has been replaced now with cheap Russian supply of energy to Asia. and in particular to China. Next year, there'll be a natural gas pipeline that's open between Russia and China. So
I mean, in fact, China is now the largest. Russia is now the largest supplier to China of oil, trumping Saudi Arabia, right? And then I was looking at the figures last night. Like, I mean, the EU trade with China is 828 billion. U.S. trade with China is 690 billion. But Russia's growing. It's still small, but it's 190 billion.
Yeah. So one thing you'll see, I think, is that those sorts of economic dynamics, right, the re-engineering of global trade and so forth, will continue. And Russia and China will be more and more interlinked, with Russia dependent on those revenues from energy sales to China, and in return receiving Chinese manufactured goods and so forth, right? But look, in the course of this connection, Chinese-Russian connection, if it persists, China will face consequences, economic consequences like those that Russia has faced. The challenge will be that it'll be tougher and tougher, I think, to maintain the cohesion of the Western response to Russia and the Western economic pressure on Russia. Because in the case of China, we depend on Chinese goods in a way that we didn't depend on Russian goods. And we are much more intertwined in a global economy with China than we were with Russia. So it will be difficult. We'll pay a higher price to impose those economic consequences on China in this hypothetical that we're discussing, and we are paying with regard to the consequences on Russia. So
that's a map of Ukraine behind you. And
it is, yeah.
When you look at that map,
look, data as an old army guy, right? You can't quite.
You gotta love maps.
You can't understand it without a map. Yeah.
Do you think, or what do you make of the analysis that the only way that Ukraine can be successful in the counteroffensive with Russia now is to set the conditions for ceasefire talks on the ground, or peace talks, or whatever we want to call them, but set the conditions on the ground, which means they're going to have to sever the land bridge from Russia to Crimea, and they're probably going to have to go for Crimea itself. Can you imagine the Ukrainians not doing that?
I can't imagine President Zelensky, or frankly, a successor, right? He's up for re-election next year, in a democratically ruled Ukraine, settling for any Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory. I mean, it's just hard to imagine. So that means that Zelensky has understandably set maximalist objectives for his military effort. So it talks about every inch of Ukrainian territory. So not only that which was violated and seized by Russia and occupied today over the last year, but rewinding the tape all the way back to 2014, which involves, as you suggest, Crimea itself. Look, Crimea is a much more difficult military objective than the Donbass, and it's obvious. It's a peninsula, so there's only limited access across that land bridge to Crimea, and that makes it a much more challenging military fight. But look, there are ways to make Crimea potentially untenable for Russian control without invading it, right? Without sending tanks across the causeway and into Crimea itself. And you could do that with long-range precision fires, rocket fires, missile fires, and so forth. You can do it by way of air support, Air Force, air power, and so forth. And in particular here, I think the key military target on the Crimea Peninsula is the home base of the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet. in Sevastopol. And the issue there, of course, is that it's that same Black Sea fleet that is based in Crimea, arms itself, right? Then goes to sea into international waters in the Black Sea and fires these long-range missiles that are devastating civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. So you have this peculiar arrangement right now, and I think untenable situation, where sovereign Ukrainian territory, Crimea, is the base for Russian long-range strikes against mainland Ukraine. And so far, Ukraine has been denied the capability to strike back and to deny those bases, those Russian bases in Crimea. And I think before we talk about retaking Crimea, a preliminary military step is to take the fight to those Russian bases in Crimea in a way that denies them sanctuary that they currently enjoy.
Last question to you. Do you feel that it's, what do you think when you hear people like Florida Governor DeSantis say, this is not really America's fight, that this is a regional conflict and it's not in America's long-term interests to be involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think it simply misreads the situation. And it goes back to where we started our conversation today, which is that this is a blatant, maybe the most blatant violation of international rules since, perhaps World War II. And you could cite other historical cases, and that would lead to another podcast episode, right? But the point is, this is as blatant as it gets in terms of one nation seizing the territory and now, illegally trying to annex that territory as its own. And we need to ask ourselves, is that the world we want to live in? Is that the world that promotes American security, that promotes global stability, that in turn links to economic trade, which in turn links to American economic prosperity? Is that the world in which we want to live? And I think the answer is no.
The answer by some Americans may be, if it's over there, it's not my problem. And maybe it stops there, but people like you, I suspect, would tell them it doesn't stop there.
Well, I think that's right. It's certainly true in my case. I don't believe that the distance alone here provides America safety. It's the principle that's being violated that's being fought over.
Ambassador Douglas Lute, it's great to talk to you, sir, and it's been hard to get you, so I appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks, Dana. Good questions, and I enjoyed our talk.